But thank you for inviting me to speak. And I believe this is the 5th year now that I've spoken for this group. It's kind of turning into an annual thing. I always look forward to talking with Delaware Tech Forum because this is where we get to dive a little deeper into some of the tech trends that I'm following. So what connects my work as both a futurist and as an investment advisor is this interest in figuring out what happens next. What I do is I look for patterns that are both persistent and predictive. And these patterns show up in a few different places. They show up in trends, they show up in cycles, they show up in systems, and they show up in numbers. One pattern that I find really interesting actually comes out from the Santa Fe Institute. And what they have found out is that all animals have roughly 1 billion heartbeats over the course of their lifetime, give or take. And that's true if you're a bird, a mammal, or a reptile. It's almost a universal constant at this point. And this actually works quite well if you're an elephant and you have about 30 heartbeats per minute. But if you're a hamster, well, it's more a matter of live fast, die young, okay? Humans are actually a little bit of an exception here. We have just around 2 billion heartbeats on average. And this is actually true whether you're rich or poor. And as a result, a lot of rich guys are trying to change this and have been putting a lot of money into longevity research in the course of the last few years. So you have a lot of Silicon Valley types that collectively have put over $1 billion into anti-aging research. And it's already a big industry. And that's because nobody wants to die of old age and nobody wants to die young. We would always rather just be age 30 for the next 60 years or so. And that's because aging isn't fun. Okay? Nobody wants to do that. So the symptoms of aging are actually fairly easy to recognize if you have an old car. Okay? So, the first symptom, one, your oil needs changing because you get gunk in the system. You'll get some dents and scratches here and there the longer you've been driving around. The engine starts running hot. The battery starts to wear out. You don't have as much get up and go as you used to. At some point, you're going to have difficulty finding spare parts at the dealership. Those aren't as easy to come by as they used to be. And eventually, you may find yourself going out of style, okay? At 100,000 miles, things just start to go wrong for no particular reason, and you find yourself going to the shop more and more often. I've actually heard it said that grandchildren are God's way of letting you know that your warranty has expired. Okay, they're still running. So let's sort of look at this last point, and that is that most of the cells in your body can only divide about 50 or 60 times, and this is called something called the Hayflick limit. And it's defined by these things called telomeres. And you can think of these as the plastic caps at the end of your shoelace. But this time, instead of covering your shoelaces, they cover the ends of your chromosomes. And every time your cells divide, your telomeres get just a little bit shorter. Eventually, your shoelaces start to fray, or in this case, your DNA starts to get corroded. So now some of you might remember going back 30 or 40 years ago about Dolly the Sheep. Does this ring a bell for anyone? Okay. So this was the first cloned mammal. I think this was back in the 80s or the 70s, thereabouts. And she was a sheep that effectively gave birth to herself. They cloned Dolly. And her kids were born with something called progeria, or accelerated aging. And they only lived about 3 or 4 years before they started running into problems. And what had happened was that the clones of Dolly were actually carbon copies of her. Not only did they carbon copy her genetic information, but they carbon copied her shortened telomeres as well. So the cloned sheep that were born to Dolly were born effectively at the age of 40 to 50 years old in human terms, okay? So that's an interesting example of sort of unexpected results of technology. So telomere shortening, along with other factors, creates something called cellular senescence. And you can think of this as kind of like zombie cells. And, they're not quite dead and they're not completely functioning. They just kind of wander around aimlessly, bumping into things and messing things up, okay? So senescent cells create inflammation throughout the body, and they infect nearby cells, causing them to age as well. So you might have noticed, for example, that you never have just one gray hair. They kind of come in patches, okay? So I'm turning 50 and I'm beginning to see this effect for myself. And that's because things happen in clusters. There's going to be a little bit of a cascade effect involved here. But there is a potential fix, and that is that scientists have found that they can kill the zombie cells in mice, and by doing so, they've been able to extend their lifespans by about 25%, which is kind of a big deal. There's actually a very inexpensive way that we can do this to extend our own lives, and it's been around forever. It's just known as eating less, okay? It's diet and it's caloric restriction. So in a 20-year study of calorically restricted diets, researchers have been able to increase the longevity of test monkeys from about 25 years on average to around 32 years or so. And that's a 25% increase in life expectancy. Not only that, but they've also found out that incidences of cancer and cardiovascular diseases were reduced by up to 50%. Diabetes disappeared altogether. And this is really pretty amazing stuff because physicians have known about this since the 1930s. It's been around for a long time, but there are some drugs now that duplicate some of the benefits of caloric restriction. One of the most famous is metformin, which has been around for a long time. It's now off patent. It's fairly inexpensive. And they found in a study of diabetics that diabetics on metformin were starting to live longer than non-diabetics, right? Which gets really interesting. And then you say, hey, sign me up for this, right? This sounds like a really good idea. And it will work, but it will also give you a lifetime of digestive discomfort, okay? Which, trade-offs. Maybe it's not quite worth it, for example. There's another drug that's come out called rapamycin, which was originally used to mitigate rejection of organ transplants. And it's delivered similar longevity benefits, but at the cost of making the immune system somewhat more vulnerable. So there are all these trade-offs involved with pharmaceutical remedies. I like to say for every gimme, there's a gotcha. My sense is that the solution may not be pharmaceutical, but rather genetic. And it's about rewriting the code of longevity and rethinking the body as software. And this is going to take some time. So back in 2015, 44-year-old CEO of BioViva, biotech company, became patient zero because her company was not given authorization from the FDA. She decided to go try some of these programs on herself, okay? Kind of DIY gene hacking. And she started experimenting on her own genes, and she did two things. First of all, she was able to extend her own telomeres by about 20%, okay, which is not insignificant. And this was a really big deal, and it was also fairly controversial because cellular immortality already exists, and it's known as cancer. And you don't want that, right? So she hasn't grown 3 heads yet, but people are watching really carefully, okay? They're just wondering what's going to happen what are the side effects here? But she didn't stop at that, because while messing around with her own DNA, she also decided to become superhuman, okay? She activated some of her own genes to facilitate muscle growth as she gets older. And you could argue that she's crossing this line between medicine and human enhancement, and things get very blurry very quickly. At this point, there are about 200 different genes responsible for aging that have been identified. And we're going to learn a lot more about these over the course of the coming years. So there is a boom that's happening in the genetic sequencing industry right now. The costs of sequencing a human genome has collapsed from roughly $100 million down to less than $800 in the course of 15 years. Meanwhile, the number of genetic tests ordered by consumers has been doubling every year since 2010, and they have a long ways to go. So you might have heard about Moore's Law as it relates to processing power for a semiconductor. This is another law saying that the costs of obtaining genetic information is dropping rapidly as it becomes more commonplace. And when you think about it, genomics is a platform industry. Okay, the more data that you have, the more valuable it becomes. I'm curious, how many in this group have had tests done by 23andMe? Okay, or Ancestry.com, they have genetic testing information. I've done that as well. And this was a really interesting process for me because I learned why I can't drink coffee. And it's because I'm a slow metabolizer of caffeine. Give me a cup of coffee and you'll be scraping me off the ceiling for the next week. It just never leaves the system, okay? And this is just one example of something known as pharmacogenetics. And that is understanding the relationship between drugs and personal genetic markers. And it's going to be an absolutely huge industry, okay? So, for example, if you could imagine someone with, we'll use diabetes as an example, suppose there are 30 or more different genetic markers that can cause diabetes. Some drugs will work based on whether or not you have the right set of markers. So, if you have diabetes and you don't have the right markers, those drugs aren't going to work. But meanwhile, if you do have the right markers, the odds of success are going to be much, much higher. So I think insurance companies are going to be all over this technology. So there are really three different phases going on here. The first phase just involves getting the data, building the system. The second involves understanding the data. And the third relates to rewriting the actual code. At the first stages, you're going to need just the physical equipment to get the data. One of the companies that I invest in is called Illumina. They're really the dominant player in the genetic sequencing space. The second stage is beginning to use artificial intelligence to make sense of that data and to understand the relationships between the various genetic markers. And the third phase is about rewriting and updating that software. So my sense is that the winners here might be the platform stocks. And a platform company really does two things. It creates its own ecosystem, and it becomes more valuable as it gathers more information about its customers. So some of the big stocks of the last 10 years, you think about Facebook, for example, which knows everything about your friends. LinkedIn knows everything about your social networks and about your job history. Amazon knows everything about your shopping habits. And at some point, genetics companies are going to know everything about you. Okay? So, as a disclosure, I own shares of Illumina and also Invitae and client accounts. And keep in mind, this is not financial advice. You may need to complete your own due diligence and consult your financial advisor. Could be me, could be Compass Ion Advisors. It's all good. Just talk to someone. Something else that you might want to look at is this ARC Genomic Revolution ETF, which is a fairly volatile exchange-traded fund, but it also gets all of the bases covered. And most of these stocks show up somewhere within that ETF. So there are some other cool technologies coming, including three-dimensional bioprinting, which is currently used to make synthetic liver tissue in bladders. I'm happy to say now that for $20,000, your dog can have a new bladder, if that happens to be an issue in your household. It is a real thing. Seriously, if you want to look at the cutting edge of bioscience, take a look at what the veterinarians are doing, right? Because they do things before they can do things on people. Equestrian vets, for example, have been practicing stem cell therapy for like the past 20 years. We can't do that on people, but we can do it on horses. Meanwhile, there's another company out there called BioStage, which has a competing technology using a bioreactor or artificial womb to grow new organs from patient stem cells. And this sort of starts to solve this whole problem of where do you go to find spare parts, right? You just get it off the rack or you have one grown for you. Meanwhile, the real cutting edge is in what are called organ chips. And it's kind of spooky stuff, and what they try to do here is they replicate the wetware of human biology and put it on a lab chip. And here we go into synthetic biology, where they create these things that are called organoids, which are miniature versions of the real thing. And it all started out a few years ago with lab-grown livers to test pharmaceutical toxicology, which is really important from a drug safety perspective. And scientists have since moved on to primitive hearts and brains even. Scientific American published a cover article, I think last spring, saying that some of these organoids have started to form their own brain waves spontaneously, but nobody is really quite sure what they're thinking at this point. Okay? We just don't know, right? So we're slowly going from research that's in vitro or in a tray to in vivo, which is with live subjects, to in silico, where we simulate the effects on the human body, or at least some vague simulation of the human body. And this enables for drug testing without actually putting anyone at risk. And this gets a little far out, a little uncomfortable, a little strange when you think about it. And I think this is sort of a later step. It's not here and now, but it's definitely coming along the way. Some of you may be familiar with Ray Kurzweil, who's a futurist who popularized the term singularity as it relates to artificial intelligence. He's also written quite a bit about life extension and feels that it's quite possible to add up to 10 or 15 years of longevity just based on lifestyle factors. And this is part of a broader strategy which eventually may include innovations in biotech and also nanotechnology. But what I really wanted to do today is show you how to live long enough to live forever, maybe. Your mileage may vary, but the basics are pretty much available to everyone. A few years ago, Dan Buettner of National Geographic traveled the world to find communities where people lived exceptionally long and healthy lives. And these are the so-called blue zones of longevity. He found one of these communities in Japan, one in Greece, one in Costa Rica, another one in California, and basically found that no continent has a monopoly on living well. But what he also found out is that most of these communities have a few things in common. First of all, for most of the people in these areas, there was a daily activity routine in terms of physical activity or exercise. It's sort of a case of use it or lose it. For my mom, who's in her 70s now, she would walk to the post office every day. Go half a mile or so, then walk back, and that was part of her social schedule, and that worked out really well for her. It doesn't necessarily matter what you do, as long as you do something. There's also something called the 80% rule, which is to stop eating when you're mostly full, not when you fill the tank up all the way, but when you're about 80% full, that's a good time to stop. They find out that you should eat like a king for breakfast, eat like a prince for lunch, and eat like a pauper for dinner. Okay, dinner should probably be your lightest meal of all. In many of these communities, they also tend to consume mostly plants. Okay, some meat's probably okay. Although some of the communities, for different reasons, may be vegetarian or vegan. Diets very heavily in berries, beans, and nuts. They've found out that people that go vegetarian actually live an extra 2 years to make up for that. They also lose about 16 pounds as a happy side effect to going vegetarian. Vegans, on average, this is really interesting, lose about 30 pounds, which starts to really add up. Drinking. Wine is good in moderation. Okay, so a glass of wine is a good thing. A glass of wine every day of the week is fine. 7 glasses of wine on Sunday, generally not. There was some research that came out a few years talking about resveratrol, which is a powerful antioxidant. There's a little bit of truth of that. But the magic ingredient to wine isn't what's in the wine, but who you drink it with. Okay, so you don't get points for drinking alone. You have to get points for drinking with friends. It has to be a social thing for you. They've also found that within these communities that they have strong social networks. They make family a priority. Many of the people participate in a spiritual community of some sort. It doesn't matter which one, okay? Just some place where you can get together with people to celebrate. And a lot of them also tend to volunteer as well, okay? So, more importantly than living a long life, what they found out is that people that live long tend to live well and they tend to be happier. And that's not such a bad thing. The amazing thing is that of the people that live to be aged 100 or more, none of them really planned to live for a long time. They just happened to be happy and they just wanted to keep things going. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. So thanks for coming out tonight and listening. Appreciate it. I think we might have some questions or some time for that if anyone wants to ask questions. Mm-hmm.
You talk about the daily physical activity. What about daily mental activities? Meditation, mindfulness, yoga, tai chi, things like that, which of course are physical and mental?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And the meditation is really interesting as a stress management. It's been shown to improve, 1, heart disease, 2, it's been able to improve diabetes primarily through diet. I notice when I'm not meditating and when I'm stressful, I tend to eat more and behave badly. Basically, I'm just a zoo animal, right? I eat when hungry, bored, or tired. And if you can avoid those things through meditation, you're generally going to have a better diet and be in better shape. So, yeah, anything else come up? Okay. Yes, please. Mm-hmm.
So, I have my Ancestry.com kit waiting for me at home.
Okay.
I haven't done it yet.
I'm getting one for my wife.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't talk about what I keep hearing is a concern that these companies are going to have that data. Do you think that's a dangerous thing? What are your thoughts on that piece of it?
Yeah. So it's a frontier at this point, right? And there was something that was passed a few years ago called the GINA Act, or the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which prohibits insurance companies from discriminating based upon your genetic data. Okay, so I think from that perspective, there's a certain degree of safety involved because your health insurance isn't going to go through the roof if they find that you have some of these hereditary diseases. Meanwhile, I'm pretty open with my data because I want to contribute to the pool of scientific knowledge so that they can start drawing conclusions to make better decisions. Okay? So it's a matter of how much of that data do you want to set into the wild versus how much of it do you want to keep to yourself. Some of the other controversies that came out with the 23andMe data is whether people can get their information back and reach the wrong conclusions or feel that they may have a need for example, mastectomy when the risk isn't as high as you might think it is. Okay? So everyone's kind of learning how do you work with the data. The latest edge is something called polygenic indicators, where they look at a whole bunch of different markers. They see how they relate to each other to come up with a better indication of risk. So, yeah, Rick. Mm-hmm.
So, Jim, always love your presentations, and two takeaways I got that I'm really psyched about. The first thing is I'm not going to work out anymore, because all I'm doing is running through my 2 billion heartbeats a lot faster than doing it.
Oh, that's true.
So
right. Yeah, no worries.
And the other thing I heard is going vegan or meat-free only saved me 2 years, so red meat's worth it from my perspective. So
Okay.
No, seriously. The thing I was asking about is the health insurance companies getting all your DNA data, and are sometimes your health insurance might be based upon whether you smoke or not, past history or something, but now you have DNA records, and it could get to the point where that could be used against you, and what your claim might be for other.
Yeah, that's what GINA was really produced to protect against. Now, sort of two implications of health insurance on genetic information. One is that they may be more inclined to do preventative medicine, which isn't such a bad thing. One of the companies that I'm tracking, which is Invitae, has an interesting business model because they're actually getting paid from both sides, okay? One is they're getting paid by the pharmaceutical companies to find patients. And meanwhile, they're also getting paid by the insurance companies to determine whether or not they should bother reimbursing the pharmaceutical companies, which is going to get really interesting. Okay. In the meanwhile, for the pharmacy companies, some of them might see some of the success rates on their drugs go from 50 to 60% to 90 to 95% once they start including the genetic data in those trials, which I think is the big thing here. Right. Yes, please.
We talk about privacy, and DNA is probably as personal as you can get from anybody. And in collecting this data, do you see or have you seen the address of where it can be anonymized? So I get my DNA test to be done, and it's not ascribed to me, so that
Right.
so that it's not used against me in terms of.
It's just part of a pool,
Yeah.
right? And nobody knows that it's you.
Yeah.
I think that's a good. I think that's a good solution. I haven't heard a lot about that yet, but it makes sense to me. Yeah. Yes, please.
So does the GINA Act, does that just address insurance companies' use of your data? What about employers or lenders?
I believe it's employers as well. I can't go so far as lenders, but it sounds like some of those protections are in place at this point. Yeah. Okay, yes. Mm-hmm.
You didn't talk too much about immunotherapy in terms of prevention, eradication of cancers or other kinds of life-shortening diseases. Thoughts on immunotherapy versus the genetic?
Thank you for asking. I was so close to adding a section on immunotherapy. And there's actually a company in FDI stage 3 trials right now that should be getting a note from the FDA this week. It's called Immunomedics, which has potential cure for breast cancer, to be specific, which I think in early tests they're like in the 30 to 40% success rate in terms of the treatment. That news should be coming out this week, and if it's positive, it's going to create a whole new chapter. That's a really hot industry right now. Actually, I was seeing that the fastest growing private employer in Delaware is a company in Wilmington called Insight Therapeutics, right? They're also in the business of immuno-oncology. So it's hot stuff and should be really helpful. Yeah. Great. Rick, yeah, one more.
One other quick question. I might not have heard you correctly, but maybe you could comment on it. So doing drug testing, right? We know how expensive a process it is through the FDA.
Right.
But if you were concerned that a certain drug's reaction, let's say on the liver or something,
Right.
did I hear you correctly that you can genetically grow a liver just for drug testing and see what the results might be on that individual organ?
Yeah. So what the pharma companies are doing is they're investing in that technology for their own treatments to determine whether or not they're safe enough to go through the process of filing with the FDA. Because if they are toxic, they're going to pull the plug pretty early or fix the problem before they start spending more money on it. So yeah, you get to run these tiny tests on things before you start getting people involved. So I think from a safety perspective, it makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about growing the livers, where does this come from? Because now we're going to go back to the telomers. Where are we getting this to initially grow it from, and wouldn't that have an effect on what the drugs are doing to that particular liver? Because it's got to come from somewhere, from someone, from something. Mm-hmm. And those markers would be specific to that person. Mm-hmm. And since everybody has different markers, so now we're talking about testing something
with those markers within those organisms.
May work for just that one person, but what about everybody else? And all the side effects that go with that.
Right. Yeah, the same complications you have in human testing. Everyone's going to be a little bit different. Although they are going to be more inclined to using standards, for example, so that you have the same markers within that whole group of subjects so that you can get slightly more stable results within that grouping. But you're right, it gets really complicated. For the most part, they're also grown through stem cells as well. And that has its own controversies too. So, cool. One more. Then we got to go.
You mentioned pharmacogenetics, where the drugs are tailored. The drug treatment is tailored towards an individual based on the genetic prototyping. Mm-hmm. And so, would that make the pharmaceutical, clinical drug research and all that a lot more efficient, because you're not giving it to people who are slow metabolizers,
right?
Or fast,
We're not going to respond, right?
Yeah, mm-hmm. You'll be giving it to people who are appropriate responders rather than fast or slow.
Correct.
So that make things efficient, so that a drug that's perfectly suitable for me might produce bad reactions in you.
Right. So I don't get it.
So that make things better.
It could save a lot of money. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's going to save the healthcare system, but it's going to keep it around for a lot longer. It's a really big deal. So, cool. Well, thanks for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to